Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a really fascinating, deeply introspective manuscript attributed to the legendary poet Elizabeth Bishop. It's called The Illuminated Edge, a mapmaker's journey. And really, what we're tracing today is an exercise in emotional cartography. We're going to explore how one of the greatest literary minds used the incredibly meticulous art of mapping, not to, navigate oceans or find trade routes, but to navigate profound loss, displacement, and the incredibly complex geography of the human heart. It's an absolutely stunning look at how we survive the unimaginable.
The manuscript kicks things off by hitting us with this incredible paradox. Quote, "A cartographer makes a representation of space, but what of time?" Just let that sink in for a second, right? We can draw the borders of a country, we can outline a continent, but how do we possibly map the shifting sandbars of our own memories? How do we chart spaces that exist only in our recollection? Spaces that just kind of reshape themselves every single time we try to remember them? This question right here, this is the fundamental challenge of her life's work.
And that brings us to a really crucial redefinition. For our narrator, cartography isn't an act of discovery, it's an act of preservation and translation. She isn't out there looking for new, uncharted territories to claim. No. For her, mapping is a core survival mechanism. It's this desperate, meticulous attempt to record and preserve what has already been lost. She maps to make a permanent record of vanished things.
To really understand why, we have to look at the landscape of her childhood in Nova Scotia. She lived with this intense division. There was the inside, her grandmother's garden, which was fenced in, cultivated, orderly, filled with these totally reliable vegetables in perfectly straight rows. But then, on the outside, beyond that fence, was the unreliable world. That was where her mother stood, talking to invisible presences, slowly slipping into madness. At just 5 years old, when her mother was permanently taken away to a hospital, the narrator learned a terrifying lesson. The world's borders are not fixed. People can literally just disappear.
So, faced with a world that was suddenly untrustworthy, what does a kid do? She developed a shield. Observation became a form of distance, and that distance was absolutely required for survival. She physically and emotionally folded herself into these small, safe corners, retreating from the chaos. By becoming the quiet child who just watched and recorded, noticing the exact bird on the fence post or the precise angle of light coming through a window, she kept herself safe. Because if you only observe from a distance, nothing can be taken away from you, since you never actually claimed to possess it in the first place.
This childhood defense mechanism built the foundation for an entire life's methodology. Just look at this inventory of loss she dealt with. A mother taken to a hospital, a childhood abruptly relocated, moving through 3 entirely distinct countries, lovers lost to time, houses that burned to the ground or were simply abandoned. Throughout her whole life, she attempted to impose a rigid order on our chaotic, completely uncontrollable grief by making lists, taking inventory, and trying to count things that honestly cannot actually be counted.
This relentless geographic displacement shaped everything about her existence. It's a staggering timeline. From losing her mother in Nova Scotia in 1916 to learning to hide her grief in Worcester in 1917, finding what she called an edge where land meets water down in Key West in 1938, then building a shared territory in Brazil in 1951, and finally landing in Cambridge in 1970 for the aftermath. The tragic irony of all this is that every single place she lived became both itself and this haunting, ghostly reminder of a vanished country somewhere else.
She actually captured this agonizing reality perfectly with one thought. She wrote, "The map is always a lie that tells the truth." Think about a standard world map for a second. You literally can't project a 3D sphere onto a flat 2D surface without distorting something. Whether it's the size of the continents or the distance between them, something always has to be sacrificed. Well, memory and art work exactly the same way. Reducing a complex, agonizing life to neat lines of poetry or symbols on a page requires sacrificing the messy reality just to find true direction and make it navigable.
So how exactly does she pull this off? Well, she transforms the unbearable into the bearable through the hyper-precise description of ordinary things. For years, a lot of critics actually thought her poetry was cold or just purely descriptive, but that couldn't be further from the truth. By focusing with absolute intense precision on the physical details of an object, like describing the 5-haired beard and the dramatic red and black scales of a caught fish, she creates this incredibly safe container for massive, overwhelming emotional displacement. The raw emotion is absolutely there, it's just safely refracted through the physical object.
Now, this lifelong practice took a really beautiful turn when she moved to Brazil and met the great love of her life, Lota. Suddenly, languages themselves became separate territories. English was precise, solitary, and safe for her. But Portuguese was this language where she was always slightly wrong, always making mistakes, but it was shared. In the delicate overlap of these two languages, she and Lota actually managed to map out a fragile, beautiful new country together. It was a shared territory built entirely in the space between their two worlds.
But, as we've learned with her story, the borders of her world are never permanent. Listen to this quote. "The green here eats everything, reclaiming what was never really mine." Lota built in this gorgeous sanctuary right in the Brazilian jungle, but eventually the overwhelming forces of politics, corruption, and obsession began to press in. Just as the relentless jungle reclaims the stone stairs of a house, madness slowly began to reclaim Lota.
Methodically, painfully, everything just fell apart, leading to an absolute failure of the map. Lota developed a severe obsession with a political park project in Rio. This led directly into a descent into extreme paranoia and nervous crisis. Ultimately, and tragically, it culminated in an agonizing overdose while Lota was visiting New York. And what followed was an ensuing, completely unmappable silence. This was a tragedy that completely and utterly resisted our narrator's lifelong tools of precise observation and careful mapping.
Which brings us to perhaps the most devastating line in all of her poetry, from her famous villanelle, One Art. The entire poem insists, over and over, that the art of losing isn't hard to master. It almost sounds casual, until the very final line, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. That parenthetical command, write it, is just raw and completely shattering. She literally has to physically force herself to write the word disaster.
That forceful, desperate command reveals everything about her process, forcing yourself to explicitly name the disaster. To literally, physically put the ink on the page is the only way to prevent that unmapped silence from completely consuming you. Writing the tragedy down, acknowledging the sheer scale of the disaster, was her final, desperate attempt to re-establish a border against the absolute, swirling chaos of her grief.
But we have to acknowledge that there was a painfully wide gap between the art and the artist. It's the classic clash, the rag and bone shop of the heart versus the architecture of memory. In reality, she was battling severe alcoholism, deep depression, and messy, uncontrollable grief. Yet the art she produced out of that pain was pristine, meticulously structured, and perfectly crafted. The agonizing truth here is that creating the beautiful architecture of poetry didn't magically fix the messy reality of the person writing it.
And that leads to a really profound, somewhat tragic realization from the manuscript. The map has consumed the territory. She spent her entire life trying to preserve her experiences by writing them down. But eventually, the act of writing the poems ended up entirely replacing the actual memories. She could no longer remember the physical fish she actually caught. She only remembered the beautiful words she wrote about it. The representation had completely eaten the reality.
Despite that tragedy, though, she passed on a brilliant philosophy to her students. It's a literal art of transformation. Step 1. Empty yourself of expectation. Step 2. Observe the world around you with ruthless precision. And Step 3. Let the image do the emotional work. It's kind of like watching a spider methodically build a web out of thin air. She taught others how to survive by looking outward, trusting the tiny details of the physical world to carry the massive, heavy weight of the emotional one.
And through that intense, almost clinical observation, something incredibly tender actually emerges. Take this line from a poem about a really grimy, oil-soaked filling station. Amidst the grease, someone had surprisingly placed a little plant and a carefully embroidered doily. Her takeaway? Somebody loves us all. In the very midst of ordinary ugliness and profound isolation, her precise observation uncovers this totally unexpected grace.
Now, this changes everything we've assumed about her so far. Attention, it turns out, is a profound form of love, discovered entirely through the act of watching without the need to possess. All those years of standing at a distance, of being the quiet observer in the room, of making herself small, it wasn't just a cold defense mechanism. To pay attention to the world so closely, to record its details so faithfully, is ultimately an incredible, lifelong act of devotion.
Ultimately, we arrive at our narrator's final triumph. It's the hard-won realization that the best map isn't made of paper or ink or even the most perfectly structured poem. The absolute best map is the messy, completely unedited territory of life itself. It's standing at the edge of the continent, looking out at the water, and simply witnessing the tide come in. Just being there, fully present, without the heavy burden of having to describe it.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to chew on. If the best map is the territory itself, the unedited lived experience, What territories in your own life remain unmapped? What parts of your life are you so busy trying to organize, structure, and record instead of simply inhabiting? It's an incredible reflection on memory, love, and the real limits of our own cartography. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this map helps you navigate your own territories a little more closely. Keep learning, keep observing, and I'll see you next time.